I think it's a very timely topic, and I'm certainly interested to hear from all of our panelists today. TOTs were originally designed to compensate local governments for the increased public service costs incurred by serving tourists. There are an incredible number of cities and counties, over 400 cities and 55 counties that impose a TOT. And I know how important that revenue stream is for local governments. I also know that local laws and ordinances don't necessarily keep pace with or anticipate technology and innovation. Each local government has different priorities based on the community's needs, and some may want to encourage innovation, and other communities may be fine with the status quo. Our first panel will cover the application and collection of TOTs, the uptick in home sharing and short-term vacation rental websites, and will highlight some of the legal issues at play. Our second panel will cover the different types of lodging in California and how those operators and platforms are interacting with local governments. And then our third panel will feature several case studies, and each of those representatives from local agencies will fill us in on how they're responding to the growth in home sharing and short-term vacation rental websites. I'd like to thank in advance our panelists, our committee members, and members of the public, and ask them to refrain from advocating for or discussing specific bills related to this issue. This is an informational hearing only and is not the proper venue to discuss legislation. And with that, it's my great pleasure to turn it over to Assemblymember Phil Ting, who is chair of the Revenue and Taxation Committee. Mr. Ting.
Thank you, Chair Mainsheim. It's an honor to hold a joint hearing today with our local government committee. And as chair of Rev and Tax, this is obviously a very important issue, not only in my city of San Francisco, but really throughout our entire state. I think we are in extraordinary, exciting times right now because we are in the middle and in the heart of an innovation economy that has really not just touched our state, but really touched the rest of the world. At the same time, we in government are struggling to keep up at times and to make sure that we can adapt as quickly as consumers and, frankly, businesses have also adapted at that same time. My city, San Francisco, and we've seen the city of San Jose have really moved at the forefront of how to set an example to work with these innovation economies and companies, but at the same time really make sure we are collecting the revenues owed and that we can maintain and reach agreement on those revenues that are owed. I think our first panel today will really begin to sort of lay the groundwork on those issues because so many cities are frankly still trying to grapple with how to handle these issues. As many of us know, TOT is a major revenue source for many cities who are heavily dependent on tourist economies. And given this particular tax and the sensitivity around that, it's obviously important that the tax be enforced fairly, that the tax be uniform, and that really all players who are in this field are being taxed fairly as well. So with that, let me just turn it over to our first panelist. We have Michael Coleman, who's the Fiscal Policy Advisor for the League of California Cities and the California Society of Municipal Finance Officers.
Mr. Ting.
Well, good afternoon, Mr. Menshine and Mr. Ting.
I think I'm sorry, but before we open testimony, I believe we were going to open it up to members for any particular opening comments. I think Mr. Chu.
Thank you. First of all, I want to thank our chairman, our committee consultants, and our stakeholders for today's discussion on the complex issues that we have at hand. I have had in recent years to become intimately familiar with the complexity of these issues after spending 2 years while president of the San Francisco Board of Supervisors in crafting and passing the first local ordinance in our state to significantly regulate short-term rentals. It took us 2 years because this topic touches on everything from taxes and insurance to housing affordability and land use to the appropriate role of government in our internet economy. And from my perspective, I think any appropriate regulation, whether it be at the local or state level, needs to protect our shared policy priorities around housing affordability, public safety, and land use without stifling the positive aspects of 21st century innovative approaches to tourism and shareable resources. Just a couple of highlights I want to mention. In San Francisco and throughout the state, we are struggling to preserve affordability, and the balance that we tried to create in our city was to help residents who are struggling to pay their rents and their mortgages to afford to live in an expensive California while preventing the wholesale conversion of residential housing into vacation rentals. I know that today's topic is going to focus a lot on transit occupancy taxes, and I'm pleased that in San Francisco we were the first city to require the collection and remission of taxes by online hosting platforms to our city. Airbnb made a welcome announcement recently that they had paid tens of millions of dollars to our city, and it is my hope that other companies will be doing the same as well. I think all of our districts have heard concerns around neighborhood safety. Our legislation required every single host to register with our city. We're in the early stages of implementation, but I know we will likely have some discussion on that. We also required every short-term rental host to have insurance in case things go wrong. And just concluding, we know that we've seen an enormous growth of short-term rentals as well as the issues that they raise, and I think it is appropriate for us to think and consider state regulation. There are likely some aspects of this topic that are that really lend themselves to a statewide approach, but probably other decisions that need to be left entirely to local hands, and colleagues look forward to working with you as we move through this.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chu. Mr. Quirk, did you have a comment?
Just wanted to thank the chairs very much for having this committee. Committee hearing, and I'm very anxious to hear what happens.
Any other members interested in commenting? Okay. So going forward to panel one, as my colleague Mr. Chu described, we obviously are in this amazing innovation economy right now, but also grappling with issues around affordable housing, around land use and zoning, and obviously cities are at the forefront of that. So again, we have as our first panelist Mr. Coleman from the League of Cities.
Good afternoon, Mr. Menshine, Mr. Ting, and members of the committees. It's good to be with you here this afternoon. I'm a fiscal policy advisor to the League of California Cities and the California Society of Municipal Finance Officers, and do a lot of work looking at local government finances. I'm going to give you a bit of an overview on the transient occupancy tax this afternoon and its importance to local governments. 431 of the 482 cities have a transient occupancy tax, and those that do not are mostly small bedroom communities. All but 3 counties have a transient occupancy tax as well. Most of these are general purpose taxes. Even more of those were actually imposed as general purpose taxes, but at some point a policy decision was made to put away some, usually a small portion or all, as in the case of San Diego, to a specific revenue fund for specific purposes. About 18 cities have earmarked some portion of it, relatively small number have done that. Usually that's to tourism and something related to the downtown development related to the tourism sector. About 85% of the $1.8 billion in annual revenue from TOTs among cities and counties goes into general funds, not into special funds for general purposes. So it's funding police officers, firefighters, emergency services, parks and recreation, the things we fund out of our general purpose general funds. But if you take out San Diego, which is a large chunk, and they're one city that earmarks it, it's actually about 95% of this is going to general purposes. The revenue is very important, really critical for some communities, as you've already mentioned. It's about 7% on average of general revenues among full-service cities, but there's a wide variation there. And cities that are not responsible for fire services, so that they contract cities typically, it's about 5% of general revenues on average. For about 80 cities, it's more than 10%, and you can see the list here of some cities that are heavily dependent upon it, and so are very much living by it. The rates vary from 3.5% up to 15% in Anaheim. You can see some of the higher rates over there. Los Angeles, Anaheim, San Francisco, Palo Alto at 14%. And the most common rate is 10%. There are additional ballot measures going on the local tax measures that come about regularly, so some of those rates are going up, and we'll come to that in a few moments. Over time, TOT revenues have grown with the economy, and if we take a look at adjusted for inflation per capita, there's some variation there. It tends to be very sensitive, obviously, to what's going on in the tourism industry. When there's downturns. A very sensitive revenue source, about $43 per capita statewide, inflation adjusted. If we look at the number of tax measures now, we get about 15 to 20 local tax measures put on the ballot every even-numbered year. That would be a gubernatorial or presidential election. And fewer in the intervening years, much fewer. There's not any particular obvious trend in those measures going up over time. TOT measures generally do okay, but not as well as other kinds of tax measures. All of the measures in the last 12, 13 years to extend or validate an existing rate without increasing it have passed. Every one of them has passed. But those that choose to do a special tax and earmark it, and it's a newer, an increased, or an expansion, only 8 of the 20 have passed. The bulk of these tax measures, though, have been for general purpose taxes, and about 60% of those have passed. If we compare this, counties are not as successful as cities in their tax measures. All 3 special taxes have failed, and about half of the general taxes have passed. If we compare this to other sorts of general tax measures, 2/3 pass, so the TOTs don't tend to actually do as well as some other tax measures. In fact, we can look at this last election in particular. You see the number of tax measures and the success rates of those in November 2014. And you see there were only 14 hotel tax measures, fairly typical for an even year November election. And there were many, many more of these add-on sales tax measures. So they're not as common, not as popular as a tax increase measure as many other purposes. So with that, that concludes my remarks.
Thank you. Any questions from the panelists?
Yeah, a quick question. So you track local election results, as I understand. Do you have any kind of insight to share on trends that you've seen for TOT ordinances over the last 10 years or so?
What we've seen in past elections is they tend to go in spurts. There was one year back in there, I'll go back to the previous slide actually to help answer your question. There was one year in here that 2009 that there seemed to be, that's an odd number year, so you wouldn't expect so many. What happened in there was both in Los Angeles County and in San Mateo County, groups of cities got together and said this is the time. And those were particular times of difficulty for cities, so people were looking at particular measures. That was the idea that was in vogue apparently at the time. So groups went together. And that's all I can deduce from that. If you look at the number of measures and the success rates over time, there's not really a clear trend going on here. But you look at the rates that are involved, many cities are really topping out and getting to the high end of the measure. So there's not much room for many of the larger cities to go. There are some cities, I believe Fresno is down at 8%, and San Jose is I think, at 8%. Is that right? So some of these larger cities do have some room to go if they chose to go that direction, but many of them are getting to rates that are probably the top of what's bearable for the taxpayer.
Okay. Thank you.
Mr. Coleman, given there's been a significant amount of litigations between cities and many of the firms regarding the actual definition around TOTs, as ballot measures have been proposed in the last 2 to 4 years, have you seen changes in the legal language with the TOTs to sort of keep up with the times?
Well, I'll have to defer to my colleague who will be here momentarily, Michael Colantuno. He's really the legal expert on these kinds of things. But I do know what you will find in these ordinances and TOT measures across the state is a fair amount of consistency. We talk with each other, we look for best practices, and there are model ordinances out there. So the problems that you find in one city, if there are problems, will be problems that you'll find in other cities as well.
Okay, great. So it appears that Mr. Colantuno is still not here. So we're going to move back to Mr. Mainshine and panel 2, and then bring him up when he arrives. Thank you very much, Mr. Coleman. Appreciate your testimony.
Okay, great. Thank you. Our next panel is on home sharing, short-term vacation rentals, and other lodging. I'd ask David Owen, who's the Regional Head of Public Policy for Airbnb, Matt Curtis, the Director of Government Relations for HomeAway, and John Caldwell, Public Policy Advocates on behalf of the California Hotel and Lodging Association, to please come forward. And then I think we'll start with you, David.
I'm David. Good afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity to come here today. I wanted to start by just giving, my name is David Owen, I'm with Airbnb, and wanted to just give a brief history of our company and community, and address some of the questions that were sent by your staff, and I appreciate their assistance in getting ready for this hearing as well. Airbnb was founded in San Francisco in 2008. We are a marketplace for unique local accommodations. We pair guests and hosts from around the world who share their homes. The company was founded in San Francisco by three gentlemen who, like many young people who moved to the city, were attempting to figure out how to afford life in one of the most expensive cities in the country, and were interested in attending a design conference. Two of them were design graduate students together, and posted on Craigslist and the internet that they had some blow-up mattresses in their apartment for other people who may be coming to San Francisco for that conference. And to their surprise, three people from different parts of the world all contacted them and ended up staying with them. They had a wonderful week. They went to the conference together. They experienced their favorite local restaurants together, and after these folks left, they thought they might be onto something. So from that experience was born Airbed and Breakfast. Thankfully, we have shortened the name. It's now much easier to email us. From there, later that year in 2008, we really came to the public's notice during the Democratic National Convention in Denver, when young people were streaming to the city to try and see the acceptance speech for a certain presidential nominee that was garnering a lot of interest at the time. And the news took notice of this new website that was helping people find local accommodations, as the hotels and other places were all sold out. If you fast forward from that moment to last year, during the World Cup in Brazil, we've worked with the Brazilian government for a period of time at their request to assist with their issues in constructing enough infrastructure around the World Cup. They knew they had events in cities across the country and were in need of accommodations that were flexible for that event. And by the end of the World Cup last year, we were the single largest accommodations provider in Brazil for the World Cup. 1 in 5 people who visited Brazil stayed in an Airbnb listing. So it was a really remarkable opportunity for us to demonstrate how we can work with government to solve issues for them. So certainly an exciting time for us. We now have more than 1 million users with listings around the world in 33,000 cities, 192 countries, perhaps a few more in the near future, we hope. And just a general idea of how the website works. When you become a host, you are able, it's a reciprocal review system, which is very important for us. Both the guests and the hosts provide reviews for one another. They provide information. You can link your profile to other social networking sites to establish your identity. We do have a verified identity program. So, for instance, my profile is linked to my LinkedIn, my Facebook profile. I have over 20 reviews from hosts in places, different cities around the world, all of them sparkling. I'm a great guest. So when I contact a host, they can see all of this information, and they can ask me additional questions. Why am I coming to town? What am I doing? And if we both agree that it makes sense, we book the listing. Airbnb charges the host, the guest's credit card at the time that booking is completed, and we remit those funds to our hosts within 24 hours of the beginning of the stay. So we charge our hosts 3%, and we charge our guests an additional fee on top of that. So if a host lists their space for $100 a night, they will receive $97. In cities where we have begun collecting and remitting on behalf of our hosts and guests, as you all know, the transient occupancy tax in California is a tax that's collected from guests by hotel operators or accommodations operators and provided to the remitted to the local taxing authority. Where we do that, we apply that in San Francisco and San Jose at the time of the transaction, and periodically we provide that. I believe it's monthly. We remit those funds to the relevant taxing authorities. I'll stop there. I believe other folks might have comments, but I appreciate the opportunity to be here today, and I look forward to your questions and a lively conversation.